For this third session of day one of the Future of the American Child journalism training in Charlotte, we're going to pivot to the issue of homeschooling. We're joined by two Washington Post reporters, Laura Meckler and Peter Jamison. They have both spent the past year or so doing a deep dive into trends and aspects of homeschooling that I am going to take the leap and ask them to tell me if I'm right, how COVID has affected parental choices to interact with homeschooling. And I'm sure all of you are aware that throughout the decades, perceptions of what homeschooling was about or why people chose to homeschool their children have changed. They've ebbed and flowed and gone in different directions. But I think what's important for you to take away from this session with Peter and Laura is a deeper contextual understanding of the role of homeschooling in American society, the role of it in the lifespan and the lives of children, and how you can go back to your communities and look around and report on this trend. So thank you, Laura and Peter, for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Laura, to take it away for the presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Rachel. Thank you all for being part of this. It sounds like the whole agenda for your for this seminar is amazing, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person to also learn from the other sessions, but Zoom will have to suffice today. So yes, this is a series that we called Homeschool Nation that ran last year. In fact, the last story ran about, just about 48 hours before the year ended. And it was led by my colleague, Peter Jameson, who's an enterprise reporter at the Post. I'm national education writer at the Post. And we teamed up with a great many other journalists at the Washington Post to make this series happen. We're going to go through the stories and tell you a little bit about each one, and then end with some ideas for local stories that can be done in this area, and then obviously questions. So one, just to set the stage a little bit, I think a couple distinctive elements of this series were, one, it has both positive and what would be considered, I think, negative stories about homeschooling. It explores both what homeschooling is giving kids, why people are drawn to it, what is working for people about it, and also the risks and concerns around homeschooling. So it very much doesn't take a point of view that all homeschooling is good or bad. It really explores it from a lot of different angles. And it also used a lot of different reporting and writing tools to tell this story. So there is narrative writing, investigative reporting, policy analysis, data analysis, and polling, all that kind of came together to tell each story being told sort of the best way it could be told. It's fair to say that underpinning this entire thing, it was the dramatic rise that we saw of homeschooling during the pandemic, which got a lot of attention. But a lot of the reporting really didn't go beyond that, just to say that it was rising. And in fact, the data that we had was pretty skimpy from the federal data on homeschooling. And it was not comparable to data that had been collected pre-pandemic. So we really, even though there was data that indicated accurately that there had been a rise in homeschooling, we really didn't know a lot. So one of the major things that we set out to do is do a real data analysis of what homeschooling looked like, and that was, well, I'm going to launch my PowerPoint that I have together here for you guys. Hold on one second. So we're just going to sort of go through this series, which involved, again, like dozens of Washington Post journalists when you add everybody together. So I'm starting with the data analysis, although this was not the first story to run. And the reason I'm starting with this is because it really sets the stage for the entire series. It was not, we would have liked to have had this be the first story to run, but it took a long time to collect this data. We set out to collect data from ideally all 50 states about how their homeschooling numbers had changed. And right off the bat, we knew that we would not be able to get data from 11 states because there are 11 states that do not require families to even report or tell the government that they are homeschooling. And there are other states where the data proved impossible to get. But this slide shows you what we found state by state. The gray states were ones that we could not get data for, and the others show you how big the increase was. So I'm going to go back for a moment to the prior slide, show this is what the overall trajectory was. The overall story of homeschooling in America is that there was this sharp rise. It was already on the rise, as you can see, before the pandemic. And then the sharp spike you see is the pandemic year. And it came down a little bit. And that was one of the questions a lot of people had is, was that spike going to endure? And in fact, it has endured. That 51% rise is since 2017-18, the net rise. So we collected data from every state that we could to try to look at this. And this is what we found state by state. Gives you a sense of it. I'm going to ask Peter to fill in more in a moment. And we also included this lookup tool where you can, this is the District of Columbia's numbers, but you can put in any school district that we have data for and see what the rise was in that district. Once we had this data, we set out to try to illustrate these numbers by, well, first of all, we did analysis to see what patterns we could find. I'm going to let Peter talk about what we found, and then to go out and find families who illustrated the various types of examples of rising homeschooling. So, Peter, why don't you pick it up from there?
Yeah, so as far as the trends we found, I mean, it's really interesting. Historically, homeschooling has had kind of an interesting trajectory in terms of which sides of the political spectrum have been drawn to it as an educational practice. So beginning in the 1970s, very early 1980s, homeschooling is something that's very popular on the countercultural left in the United States. One of the early proponents of homeschooling is a man named John Holt, who proposes this idea of unschooling, which is actually, kind of a liberation of children from any structure of formal education, the idea that kids can learn what they want to learn when they want to learn it. But homeschooling has really taken over and, in many ways comes to be dominated in the ensuing decades by people who have a very different political orientation from Holt, namely, very conservative Christians. I mean, this is like the early days in the 1980s of what we now know as the religious right. And homeschooling for these people becomes a very sort of powerful tool for shielding their children from what they believe to be the malign influence of public schools. So, for the ensuing decades, really up through the pandemic, there's a very defined kind of political valence to homeschooling. There's still, what people in the movement kind of refer to as like the granola homeschool crowd. Your sister-in-law out in rural Oregon who is way far out on the left and is homeschooling her 8 kids on a commune, but really that's kind of an outdated image of homeschooling, and homeschooling both in terms of the families who are doing it, but also in terms of the advocacy organizations that form, kind of the lobby infrastructure around homeschooling is really dominated by conservative Christians and people on the right. So this was one thing that Laura and I really wanted to set out to understand is whether this is still the case or not. And we'll get to our poll results and talk about them a little bit. But, you can already see in our data analysis that really homeschooling is growing across every sort of measurable line of politics and demographics. So, we see, 300+% increases in homeschooling in parts of the Bronx and New York City. We also see 300+% increases in homeschooling in South Carolina, and sort of, more conservative ex-urban areas. So, just looking at the data from where homeschooling is growing and how much it's growing, you could see that, this is not a practice that you can really define by particular geography, whether that's urban or rural or suburban, any more than you can define it at this point by politics. And I think, I know we're going to talk later on about some story ideas that all of you could pursue when you go back to your own coverage areas and your homes. But, this is one that to me is really interesting is that um, while we have this sort of meta trend in homeschooling that you can see in the graph that Laura just showed you, one of the I think the story of homeschooling going forward. Thank you, Laura. I think the story of homeschooling going forward is going to be much more one of kind of a regional divergence in trends. So I think that, it makes sense to look at homeschooling through the beginning of 2024 in the way we're looking at it here is kind of like, what are the national homeschooling trends? Because we saw such huge increases everywhere and really everywhere, at least in most states, this is the trend we saw, this huge spike during COVID and then this slight dip, and then it remains very elevated. But what we can already see in 22, 23 is that there's going to be this big divergence in homeschooling trends by state. So in some states, homeschooling is actually returning almost to pre-pandemic levels. For instance, Maryland, Georgia, it's gone way back down. I mean, it's still increased over 17, 18, but not the kind of really precipitous increase that you see in some other states. Whereas in places like Florida, in New York, certainly South Dakota, California as well, homeschooling has gone up a lot, but in some of these states, homeschooling is still growing. So it never, like in some states, I believe, we list them in our story, and I can't remember off the top of my head what they are, but there are states where homeschooling has grown year over year. I know South Dakota is one of them. Every year since the pandemic, since the onset of the pandemic. So, I think what we're going to see is really a continued acceleration of homeschooling and its popularity in those places, in other states like Florida. Whereas in other states, homeschooling may continue, may subside to something like the level it was pre-pandemic and no longer be such a huge part of the educational landscape. But for those of you who might live in states where that trend holds, where homeschooling is still going up year after year, I think that's something really worth examining.
All right, let's keep going because we have a lot of stories to go through. So, eh, okay, there's a lookup tool. All right. So this was in fact the first story that ran, which was a narrative piece by Peter. So why don't you talk briefly about the story?
Yeah, so this was sort of an interesting lead-off story in a series about homeschooling because it's actually about a family that is not homeschooling, or at least is turned away from homeschooling. So, why are we writing about a family that's turning away from homeschooling in the series, which is all about all the American families who are turning to homeschooling? The reason is that this couple, these parents, Aaron and Christina Beal, they're a couple who really grew up in kind of the white hot core of this conservative Christian homeschooling movement that I was just talking about, and whose parents really saw homeschooling as an exercise of religious liberty, something that was very important in the way they raised their family. And Aaron and Christina ultimately, for a number of reasons that the story goes through, decide to turn against this and, initially send one of their kids who had been homeschooled to their local public elementary school, and then eventually send all their kids there, at least the three of their four children who are school age, and really come to embrace the public education system. And, this is a remarkable thing because this couple, Aaron and Christina, had really been taught all their lives to believe that public schools are not only bad or that you get a bad education there, but they're sort of actively evil places. I mean, the word demonic is not too strong an adjective for the way that Aaron and Christina were taught to perceive public schools growing up. And their decision to send their children to public school really caused a rift within their own families. And I think that uh, the so Aaron and Christina are part of sort of a larger trend you can see, including some figures from popular culture, such as Ginger Duggar-Vuolo of the reality TV show 19 and Counting, or I don't know if it got up to 20 and Counting. I can't remember how many children the Duggars had when that show stopped running, um, but there are a number of children who are raised in evangelical Christian homeschooling families who have now turned against that and say that it actually had a very negative influence on both them as children, and they feel like they're really harmed by it, but also that it negatively affected their educational and professional prospects in really profound ways. That's not the unanimous judgment of kids who grew up in these families, but it is enough of a trend that it's been noticeable. And I think these uh, families and these children, now adults, are very interesting because they're sort of the first generation of American homeschooling to really come of age, of kids who were raised in homeschooling. And so I think the verdict that they render on their own homeschooling experience and how it affected them, even if they're turning away from it, even if it's negative, is still very important. Even if many other families are choosing to embrace homeschooling right now. So uh, that was Aaron and Christina.
All right. So in that story, we included embedded a Tell the Post link where we asked, which took them to the survey to tell us about their homeschool experience, and we had a tremendous response to this. About 1,200. We put this link in a couple other stories too. About 1,200 responses from readers telling us their stories, um, which was a resource for future reporting when we were looking for particular types of parents, also just reading through the responses to give us a sense of where people were coming from. We put them into a spreadsheet. This is just a little glimpse of what the spreadsheet looks like. I couldn't really capture the whole thing on one slide, but these were individual people wrote long narrative responses to these questions about their own experience, which really told us that there were people who wanted to talk about this. And we also, the Post, used this list twice to send emails out to tell them about future stories in the series. So just to keep sort of momentum going on that. Okay, the next story was one I wrote. This story is about the changing nature of homeschooling. So as you can see the headline there, the idea, this traditional notion of homeschooling being moms sitting next to the kids at the kitchen table and going over their work. Obviously, that's still true for some, but increasingly there is a much broader definition of homeschooling. And in fact, often it's parents dropping their kids off, not even doing the teaching at all. There's always been co-ops where parents come together, but the parents have always been intimately involved. Now we have things like micro schools and pods and other things where they're in some cases run by for-profit companies where kids essentially do online school in a group together. This is a photo. The woman that you see there kneeling down in the white jacket works for Prenda, which is a company that um, creates these micro schools. She is not a teacher. She has no training in teaching whatsoever. She's a guide, is her title, and she's a business person looking to, as she says in the story, to grow her business and to create more micro school. But these kids are with her 4.5 days a week. And she is the one that they're coming to when they have questions. And she, even though they're doing some of their work through online programs, she's guiding them through other pieces. So it does raise some questions. This is just the nut graph from the story. The fact that these look very different, real time and recorded virtual instruction. For a growing number of students, education is on a continuum between school and home, in person and online, professional and amateur. This new world of homeschooling. The story also went into the external factors that were driving the rise of homeschooling. This isn't just purely organic. One of them is government. In a lot of states, there are now educational savings accounts, which are like sort of vouchers on steroids, where you get the voucher and you can use it for any educational expense you want. But if you're attending a private school, of course, you're probably going to use most, if not all of it, for tuition. But a lot of these educational savings accounts also allow you to pay for homeschool expenses. And companies like Prenda are expanding into areas where these ESAs exist. There's a nonprofit driving it as well. A lot of school choice people who have been active towards vouchers and other school choice policies are very supportive of anything that's outside the traditional system. And they've given a lot of money in charitable giving toward homeschool organizations. And finally, there's this for-profit piece with venture capitalists investing, millions of dollars into new businesses serving this market. But this story also really showed, as did others in our piece, why homeschooling was rising and what the goal was. This is a picture of a kid named Logan who is on the autism spectrum, and he likes to wear his banana costume. And when he was in public school, he was relentlessly bullied and teased. And now he was in this micro school in New Hampshire, and doing really well, feeling really good, very supported. It was a very supportive environment. Even if I had some questions about the teaching and what these kids were really learning, there was no doubt after my visit that this was a very safe space where people felt good. By the end of the day, he had actually taken the banana costume off. Um, I'll just run through this. Peter, you can add anything if I forget it, but that we also took the call outs as part of that micro school story, and we did short narratives about 5 different families to show the range of what they were, of why they were homeschooling. Is there anything, Peter, you want to add to that?
No, I just, this was sort of something we did instead of what might be your, typical, like, the type of stories, frankly, that had run a lot on homeschooling during the pandemic, where, you take family X or Y and kind of show how they think homeschooling's wonderful. We didn't really want to follow that template, but we did want to give voice to these people who had come into homeschooling about why they chose to do it, what they thought worked well, and also what the challenges were. So, the way we chose to do that was in this sort of as told to or voices of feature, where we just actually one of the lead pilot on this was a former post intern who's really brilliant, Prayag Gordy. He went through that huge spreadsheet of 1,200 responses, and culled it down to about a dozen, and then ultimately these are the people who chose to talk to us, and we just sort of interviewed them and then edited their interview responses into these kind of mini essays, explaining their perspective on homeschooling. So that's sort of the function that this served.
Yeah. Okay. Peter, why don't you talk about this story? Maybe briefly, just because we have a lot to get through.
Yeah. So this again goes back to the lingering influence. As we'll soon see in future slides, homeschooling has become much more diverse, both demographically and also politically. But the conservative Christian infrastructure of the homeschooling movement that was developed in the 1980s still exerts a lot of power and has actually been very influential, not just in homeschooling, but also in kind of the broader discourse over education in the United States. So, this is a story that I did with my colleague Emma Brown, who's an investigative reporter at the Post. And we basically trace the influence that this one homeschooling leader, Michael Ferris, who's arguably the most prominent leader of the modern homeschooling movement. He's a conservative Christian attorney, originally from Washington State. But just the influence he had in sort of making this idea of parental rights in education really gain purchase on the right, which of course it has with the creation and growing influence of groups like Moms for Liberty. But some of the ideas that have fueled these groups have been around for a while, and the story was sort of meant to illuminate those early, the origins of these ideas, and then how they became more widespread.
So we really wanted to understand why people were homeschooling today and whether it had changed since the pandemic. Our hypothesis was that with the influx of new families, the rise of these micro schools, that we were going to see a very different makeup of homeschoolers today. And in fact, that is what we found in this poll. This was a really wonderful effort by our polling team because it's not that easy to poll homeschool families. They did it through a panel. I obviously am not an expert in this, but there's a panel of people who agreed to participate in polls. A few places have these panels, and they were able to screen for finding people who homeschool and then get enough of them into this poll so that we had a representative sample. So through this, we were able to show we asked the same questions that the federal government had asked in the past about the motivations for homeschooling and some other things, and we were able to see that homeschooling today, as the headline said, is in fact less religious, was the major finding, and in general more diverse, as well as see what some of the other motives were. It shows the religion numbers. Starting with the first three data points are the federal poll, and then the final data point is our poll, it going from more than 60% to 34% who say that they teach their child at home to provide religious instruction. And this was, it's probably hard to read from where you are, but this is a graphic that shows what the reasons were that people choose to homeschool. So about halfway down, you'll see, I don't know if you can see my cursor there, 34% providing religious instruction. So it's, still a great number, but nowhere near as much. The top ones were concerned about school environment, provide moral instruction, which we actually unpacked in a subsequent question and determined that those were not all, that was not stand-in for religion. Satisfaction with academic instruction. And then things that are talked about some, but you see how powerful they are. Concern about school shootings, 62%. Concern about bullying, 58%. And then interestingly enough, since homeschooling is always, yes, in the beginning it was people on the far left, but for many years it's been dominated by conservatives. And in fact, we see 46% saying that they're homeschooling in part because local public schools are too influenced by liberal viewpoints. But yet we also found, which we found almost more interesting than that, was that 26%, one in four, said the local public schools were too influenced by conservative viewpoints. So it is going both ways. And we talked to people, for instance, in Florida who were like, my kid's not being taught real history. So it does show the diversification of homeschooling today. Okay, then what we did, this just briefly, this is a file we did, we called takeaways. These were 5 takeaways from the poll and the data story. We had a lot of conversation about whether those two should be separate stories or one story, since they were both together describing homeschooling today. We ultimately decided separate stories, which I think was definitely the right call because we had so much information from each, but we did put them together in one file as a sort of a reader-friendly thing to do, where they could see five takeaways when you pull together our information from data collection as well as the poll. So, okay. Now it's fair to say this next story by Peter was not one of the more positive portrayals of homeschooling in the series. Why don't you talk about this story?
Yeah. So this is, homeschooling, while it, works out great for some people, even works out great for many people, there's this concern that child welfare advocates have expressed for a long time now that homeschooling is really the only practical legal way as a parent in the United States where you can prevent your child from having any contact with other adults outside your household if you want to do that. And, we have a child welfare system and a child protection system in the United States. Obviously, it's set up state by state, but they share in common this idea that, and they take for granted the idea that the public schools and the fact that young children appear in schools every day, that's sort of like the first alert system for signs of child abuse. Teachers and school personnel, statistically speaking, make up the largest category of mandated reporters of child abuse. And so when you remove a child completely from that system, obviously concerns arise about whether abuse might be concealed. And in fact, there have been really horrific cases where abuse has been concealed. And this story examines one of them from a few years ago, a young boy named Roman Lopez, who he was pulled out of school to be, quote unquote, homeschooled by his stepmother, a woman named Lindsay Piper, who's now serving a 15-year life prison sentence in California for his murder, and was subject to really kind of grotesque forms of abuse, in some of which, and this is not at all uncommon in the literature on severe forms of child abuse, some of which his siblings were actually coached to participate in. So, he was tortured, he was starved, he was zip tied inside of closets, and ultimately the police found his body inside a storage container in his family's basement. So really horrific, tragic case. The role that homeschooling played in this, and this comes directly from two of Roman's stepbrothers who I spoke to for this story, and also who gave victim impact statements in their parents' court cases. But, they believe that their stepmother pulled all of them out of school, but Roman in particular, because you could not have treated a child the way she treated him without somebody outside the household noticing. Um, and in fact, what happened when she pulled him out of school? They live in a state, Michigan, which is one of the states Laura mentioned, where it's one of the 11 so-called no-notice states where you're not required as a homeschooling parent to give any notification, even that you're homeschooling your child, let alone submit to any form of oversight. And so, she just pulled him out of school, didn't have to tell anyone, and he essentially disappeared until years later his body was discovered. So, this is a really tragic case of how homeschooling, and specifically the lack of homeschooling regulation, essentially in states like Michigan or Texas or Illinois or Connecticut or these 11 no notice states. And I'd encourage each of you, to check and see what the homeschooling regulations are in the states where you report. But in these states, homeschooling can be used and has been used to conceal really grotesque forms of child abuse and child murder. This is kind of a tricky story to write because you don't want to give the impression that all homeschooling families, abuse their kids, let alone murder their kids. And in fact, the vast majority don't. But you know, um, the minority, the subset of children who this does happen to because of lax regulation is important, because this is what we have regulations of any kind for, is to prevent really terrible outcomes in the small minority of cases where they otherwise wouldn't occur. So that's what this story about Roman Lopez looked at.
So I wanted to look, we thought it was important for the series to try to answer the question of how homeschools fare academically. And I started looking into this, and I quickly discovered that, the research was frankly not that interesting. It basically said they do okay, like, sometimes a little better, sometimes a little worse than public school students. But once I started looking into this question of research, one thing became very clear, which is that this one guy, Brian Ray, whose picture you see, had had an outsized influence on the perceptions of how students had done. And that what he tells people is that homeschool students do far better than public school students. And he's very prominent. And so I started looking into this. There was one other study that said the similar thing. I started looking at both of these, but quickly became focused on Brian Ray and discovered that there were a few things about him. Number one, his research had fundamental flaws, which is the fundamental flaw of his research is that it is based on standardized tests that not all homeschool students have to take. In fact, most homeschool students do not take standardized tests. The people who take them are people who choose to take them, except for just a couple states. In almost the entire country, it is completely voluntary and optional. So you have a highly the people who are opting into it are much more likely to be people who will do well on standardized tests, or parents who are teaching material specifically that is covered by these tests. So that was the first thing that we found. That is the sort of the fundamental problem. Where, of course, as you all know, in public schools, everybody takes the test, whether you want to or not, whether you're doing well or not. There were other problems with his research as well. And he also he sort of presents himself as a member of the academy. He has a PhD and talks in the language of academics in certain circles. He actually is really a homeschool activist. He homeschooled his own 8 children. He is very much in the world of the very conservative Christian homeschooling. And in certain speeches to that world, he talks about homeschooling not just being something that he recommends or that is good for kids, but in fact is biblically commanded. So it's not exactly who you'd consider a neutral source on this, and yet He is all over the media. He has been quoted by everybody. He's on NPR shows. He is testifies before state legislatures on a regular basis, presenting this research that very few legislators ever question about. Every so often one does, but often they don't. They just sort of accept it as fact that homeschool students do far better than public school students. And he also testifies in child custody cases, which are usually behind closed doors. But there are some decisions, appellate court decisions, where his work is specifically cited as to why, when there's a dispute between parents about whether the kid should be homeschooled or not. So this, and then as just sort of a bonus piece of this story, discovered that in fact his own daughter was very unhappy with the homeschooling that she received. She said she was taught almost no math, and that in fact he regularly used corporal punishment and what she considered to be abuse, physical abuse, on his children. So that was that story. This was, as part of that story, I wanted to also tell people, well, what we actually, sorry, this is so kind of blurry. What does the research really show us? Okay, you're telling me all what why this guy's research is a problem. What do we really know? And we decided to just, this was embedded in the story, this chart. We picked 5 studies that showed that were among the best studies out there of homeschooling. And as you can see, one of them says that, or maybe you can't see, that homeschoolers performed higher on SAT college entrance exams, but the advantage shrunk when differences in family background were controlled. There's another one that showed that they were did better. Those in structured settings did better, but those in unstructured settings did worse. So in other words, it's just a real mixed bag. But so we represented that. Instead of having a long narrative that would probably put most readers to sleep, we presented the research in a chart like that. Okay, this is the final story that Peter and I did together about oversight and regulation. I think we're each going to talk about a piece of this. Why don't you start? Why don't you talk about the regulatory piece, and I'll talk about the ESA piece.
So this was basically a story that wanted to look at, okay, like what is kind of the state of homeschooling regulation? I mean, everyone says that there's minimal regulation, it's very lax. What does that actually mean? How can we, what more can we tell people about that? So that's what we set out to do. And there are kind of 2 parts to this story. One is the story of how homeschooling regulation has diminished really inexorably over 40 years since homeschooling first became widely legal in the United States. And that's another thing to keep in mind. If any of you do chose to, go back and write about homeschooling, you should never forget that homeschooling really didn't happen on anything like any kind of wide scale. As late as the early 1980s, it wasn't exactly illegal, but it existed in a legal gray area. And in the places where it was legal, you had to have a teaching certificate to do it. So this is a very novel form of educating children in this country, at least in the modern age of compulsory schooling. So, but the story really charted how homeschooling activists, the chief group among them is called the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. This is actually an explicitly conservative and Christian group that was founded in 1983 and has really, fought homeschooling regulation anywhere it could, whether that's dismantling existing regulation or fighting back against proposed re-regulations of the kind that again sometimes are proposed when there are really horrific cases of child abuse of homeschooled kids. So what we found, and there's another map in here that we put together, but was that, if you're looking just at the piece of homeschooling oversight that deals with academic performance, that's nothing to do with mandated reporting of abuse or vaccination or anything like that, but just academics, there are only 3 of the 50 states where all homeschoolers are required to take a standardized test at some point. In the majority of U.S. states, you don't have to take any form of academic assessment if you're a homeschooled child. And the ones that are in between, there are various forms of assessment, but it could be a standardized test that you could give at home or opt out of, or your kid has to take the test, but you never have to show it to anyone, or you could submit a portfolio of student materials. So various kinds of, what we call like soft assessment that aren't especially meaningful, especially compared to the battery of standardized testing that children in public schools have to go through.
And then the sort of twist on this also is that we talked earlier about these educational savings accounts, which give money to homeschoolers. And you would think that this would be like such a boon to the homeschooling world. Yeah, you're getting public money to do this. In some cases, up to maybe $8,000 or $9,000 per child. And yet, the traditional Christian homeschooling association, they are very not just skeptical, concerned, but straight up opposed to these measures because they really fear government regulations, and they fear that with government money will come government regulations. And in fact, they're right. In some cases, like in Florida, for instance, if you accept the educational savings account, you do have to take a standardized test. There is some notion of accountability. So the irony being that the homeschooling movement fought for years to minimize slash eliminate or prevent any regulations whatsoever on what they're doing. And now these ESAs are in some cases bringing in regulation. You see very few places where there's a stepped up requirements on homeschooling, but yet we have seen those in these places where there are rules associated with the educational savings accounts. Now, they're not always rules attached to them, but there often are. And so you do have this irony that the main beneficiary of going from a voucher to an ESA is in fact a homeschooler. And in fact they don't always even want the money, although I think that a lot of regular families are in fact voting with their feet and taking the money, but there is a slice of folks who don't want it. So it was sort of a complicated it's a very complicated story to write that Peter masterfully pulled together, because it was about both the dismantling of this oversight and also the ways that is somewhat coming back.
Yeah, and I would just add one thing to what Laura said, which is that I think this is one of the areas in terms of further reporting on homeschooling and its effect on kids looking forward in education policy. This is going to be these ESAs and what homeschoolers do with them, how popular they are among homeschoolers is going to be a really big story moving forward. I think there's already evidence that there's a divide between kind of the rank and file of homeschooling families and their leadership organizations on this subject, which is just what Laura described. A lot of the families want the money. I mean, if you have 5 kids and the state of Florida is offering you $8,000 for each of those 5 kids every year for homeschooling, that's a real financial sacrifice not to participate in the program when all you have to do is take a standardized test once a year. So, this is going to be an interesting thing to watch. And, we could potentially see diminishing clout for the big homeschooling, like the movement leadership, if they continue to be opposed to these programs, which, already are proving to be very popular and probably, will continue to prove to be very popular among, ordinary homeschoolers.
Yes. And also, of course, even apart from homeschooling, the rise of ESAs and the impact is a good story too. So here are a few ideas for you to think about. I am not somebody who believes that reading PowerPoint slides to people who know how to read is a great idea. So I will just let you look at those ideas yourself. And why don't we transition? I'll leave the slide up, and why don't we transition into Q&A? And if anyone has any questions for us.
It's given me a lot to think about because, as long as I've been in the news business, there was always this hardwired perception that homeschooling was for religious fundamentalists, and that's the only people who accessed it. So this is an important trend for us to stay on top of. Are there any questions right now from the journalists, from our fellows?
If not, you're going to hear me read the slide.
I had one thought and one thing, and I guess, as we send our fellows back into their newsrooms or back into conversations with their editors, sometimes we have to sort of arm them with top-line pitches for their editors, and they have to say it in a way that resonates with the editor. And so a couple came to my mind, and I wonder if it's accurate and if we can tell them to do that by saying, you know, the impact of COVID and sort of a general societal unease or stress or whatever that we're going through at this point in our country's history could be fueling this desire to pull children out of public schools and out of any real spaces that they can't control. And so let me look around in my community to see if that's the case. Is that one way that they could walk back to their newsrooms and do that?
Yes, and I would say it's a twofer. It's both all of the frustrations that people feel about public schools, whether it be school shootings or COVID recovery or bullying or whatever you have that combined, these sort of the litany of issues that kids face and schools face, combined with the new options that are out there, combined with the lack of regulations, all creates this environment that makes it very friendly for people to give this a try. Because I've talked to lots of parents who work full time and they're homeschooling, quote unquote. This is not that unusual. So yes, I absolutely think that's true. And I also want to just while I have the floor, spotlight one, even though I said I wasn't going to read that slide. One a story idea that I put on there that I do think is worth looking at, which is that if you're in a state that does have some sort of regulation, that does require, for instance, somebody to submit a portfolio or a test to the local school district, one question that you could ask is whether they do anything with that. Because some of the reporting that we found when we were doing this, and this is not systematic, but anecdotally ran into lots and lots of schools that were saying, or officials who were saying, that nobody ever looks at this stuff. So that's a story that could be looked at locally in a more comprehensive way, most likely. So.
Question over here.
Just
go ahead, Peter.
Piggybacking off that and going to what you originally saying. I mean, I think it's no coincidence that homeschooling has grown in popularity at the time it has. I mean, the pandemic played a role, but I think also we live at a time of certainly I think in my lifetime, sort of unprecedented political and social fracturing, and this sort of idea of the shrinking of the political commons and of things we all, baseline things we can agree on as a society, has really fed the homeschooling trend. And I mean, in a way, this is sort of the furthest you can take the atomization of our society is to have go completely from a system like a public school where children of all different economic levels and races and backgrounds are put together to learn the same things, to have all of these kids going into these sort of self-selecting groups to learn things, often based on shared ideology or kind of shared socioeconomic status among their parents. And I think, that's a very, very important trend, I think, to kind of keep an eye on, and as far as it plugs into some of the larger things happening in our country politically and socially.
Hi, I'm Aaliyah Wong with USA Today. My question actually is a good segue from that. I know even before the pandemic, we saw a major uptick in homeschooling among Black and African American families. I know in my home state of Hawaii, we've seen an uptick in homeschooling among Native Hawaiian families interested, who see it as a form of reclaiming their culture and teaching in the indigenous language. I'm curious if there are whether there are ethnic groups or sociocultural communities that have helped fuel this rise in homeschooling that we haven't read as much about, beyond sort of the conservative Christian populations that have fueled the growth.
Well, I mean, conservative Christians are not the ones that are fueling the current growth. They're, in fact, becoming a smaller share of the total. One thing our poll showed, it definitely showed that the homeschoolers are becoming more racially diverse as a group. And we definitely saw in our polling a spike in Latino homeschooling. So we did not actually see a rise in the share of homeschoolers who were Black, but everybody was rising, so they were rising along with everybody else. But we did see a rise in the share of Hispanic or Latino families who are homeschooling. So that is, I think, a group that is worth more investigation, not something that we went into a great depth on in our reporting.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think there's just an enormous number of stories to be written on this front. I haven't read the story about an uptick in homeschooling among Indigenous people in Hawaii or elsewhere. I think that would be, I'd be fascinated to read more about that. But again, what Laura pointed out about rises in homeschooling in Latino communities, this didn't come out in our poll so much, but it is something that emerged just when I would go through the list of homeschooling organizations in some states. It seems like there are many homeschooling communities forming among Muslims. So people who are, dedicated to, a certain form of religious education that's, Islamic. There seem to be a lot of groups like that out there, and I haven't read that story either, and I think that would make a great story. So
another question or thought that I had about doing this story is I saw a headline the other day that sort of suggested that public schools had this coming. They had it coming all along because of disinvestment and salaries and everything that we know is wrong with public schools, that this was just a natural outcome of the decline of public schools. And I wonder if that's a correct way or is it rather a dystopian view of we're screwed, so people had to figure out something to do with themselves. But is there a way to sort of parallel covering homeschooling with the decline of public schools?
Well, it's both a driver. It's both. There's both a chicken and an egg piece to this, right? Because you have problems in homes with public school, which prompts some parents to homeschool, and then the more parents who homeschool, there's an impact on the public schools because they lose that money, the per pupil funding for every student who leaves. So I also think it's interesting. You see some places that are allowing a blurrier line where they let students come and take just maybe one or two classes at public schools, or they'll let them play on sports teams. That's pretty common now. But especially that part-time schooling type situation, hybrid schooling, I think is interesting. That is somewhat new, but yeah, I think it's all of a piece of what Peter was talking about a minute ago, which is this idea of, do we have a shared community? Often the school is the center of the community. We quoted this one, I think it was a teachers union official in Kentucky, as talking about how, when there's natural disasters or when there's trouble in a community, like often the school is the center of that, and that this rejection of public schools and farming out and spreading out of where kids are being educated, the more that happens, the more that we eat away at that core. So I do think that is a meaningful and important thing to continue reporting on.
Yeah, and I think as well, thinking about, I do think that while the straightforward narrative of this being sort of a rejection of the public schools is, in many ways, I think, inadequate. But you can't connect parents' dissatisfaction with what they perceive as the failures of their public school system from the rise in homeschooling now. And I think that, having a slightly wider lens on what that means and what parents are asking for from their public schools is a good thing. I mean, one thing that Laura and I found in our reporting is that there are a lot of kids, we found this in our data analysis, many kids have been pulled out to homeschool in the last few years who are, zoned for really excellent public school districts. So it's not just a matter of good teaching and good academics, but what you often hear when, we would follow up and interview these families is they, have a lot of dissatisfaction, in particular with how the schools might be handling certain special needs the child might have, how they're implementing an IEP. Since we're in a room full of journalists, I don't think I need to spell out that acronym, but just that it's interesting the reasons you hear from parents who begin homeschooling when they're rejecting as their option what is really an excellent local public school. It's often over things about like trust with their teacher or, how a child who, again, might have special needs or might be on the autism spectrum or have an attention disorder was being treated in school. So, having just like a wider understanding of what success and failure means in a public school from a parent's perspective.
So, we have one more question we'll ask at the back.
Stephen Saha with the Gulf States Newsroom. Have you seen anything or seen any research on the idea of like people leaving homeschooling, trying to go back to public school, going to public school for the first time? Because even imagine those homeschooling programs that are even doing well, it's a pretty different curriculum from where someone might be, say, returning to sixth grade. I imagine there's a lot of challenges with that.
So the question is, how does it go when kids return to public school?
Yeah, and if that also keeps more kids in homeschooling from the idea of like the concern about how that transition would go.
I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm on a bunch of homeschooling Facebook groups, and I even now still see like conversations, people posts about, so this is totally anecdotal, about their decision making, and I think that we also do know from some data that often kids do return to public school for high school. Parents feel less equipped to teach higher level subjects, although some do end up enrolling their kids in more academically minded kids in like community colleges or in other sort of like dual enrollment type situations. So I don't know if like fear of going back, that they're going to be behind, is what keeps people in homeschooling. I mean, it's a question that would be worth testing with asking some people. I'm not sure if that's true. I think that there is a sense, at least I picked this up from these Facebook groups, that when even parents who feel like they really do need to bring their kids back to public school because it's not working, that like if they do that, that they are some sort of failing, like that they've tried this and that they've failed this and that they should keep trying harder. And there's a strong, I think that exacts a strong pull on some parents, that they feel like, one person I saw posted something recently where they said, my kid refuses to do any work. All he'll do is video games all day long. And no matter what I do, he will not do the curriculum. I'm trying to make it child-led, but he just won't participate. And there are a few people who responded, well, he may need to go back to public school. Like that, this just might not be working for him. And then others are like, keep trying harder. In fact, most people were like, keep trying harder, don't give in. And I was thinking, maybe give in.
I think this is going to be an important thing to keep tabs on. I mean, I think, especially among, as many of them are, the parents who began homeschooling over the last few years who have younger children, do they want to gamble their child's college prospects on their ability to teach effectively as they get into high school? Now, as Laura mentioned, there are a lot of options available to people now. You don't have to be the sole teacher of your kid, but whether there's sort of a mass return to public schools among, as this kind of cohort of younger children ages, I think will be an interesting thing to watch, interesting source of future stories. I mean, I think not only could it be the parents' decision, but, a teenager may not want to be home with mom and dad hanging out all day, or you may not even be satisfied with seeing their friends at a co-op a couple times a week. They may actually want to go to high school. So I think some of that might drive that. And then, a good story, I think, to do, or a good way to think about this will be, assessing how schools reabsorb those kids. I mean, one thing that we've heard, and this has been a source of feedback we've actually gotten from a lot of public school teachers who have homeschooled kids who enter in 9th or 10th grade, is that and again, we haven't tested this assertion, so we don't know whether it's accurate or not, but at least anecdotally, they say they believe that homeschooled children are often behind academically when they return to school after a hiatus of several years or more. So, watching what happens with that and how the schools reabsorb those kids, I think, is another potential, good source of stories.
We have...
Yeah, which goes back to this idea that homeschool students are all like high-flying uber achievers. There's like a lot of spin about that. I watched this one state legislative hearing where I just couldn't believe this. There were a bunch of homeschool kids in the audience, maybe 6 or 8 of them or something like that, who had come because they were talking about homeschool regulations. And one of the legislators on the committee was like, look at how well behaved they are. Like, my kids wouldn't be this well behaved, as if this was some sort of indication of how all homeschoolers are in any way, shape, or form. Obviously, these kids are handpicked to be at this hearing, and yet the tone was sort of like, this all shows how great homeschooling is. It doesn't show anything of the sort. So if we leave you with nothing else, like, just if someone tells you all homeschoolers do better, just like really interrogate that in your area or in your state or nationally, because I just don't think that's we have evidence of that.
I think we've got some strong evidence of the interest in this topic, because the journalists won't let me let you go. So we've got one last, seriously people, this is the last question for Joan and Peter.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Corey Mitchell, a reporter with the Center for Public Integrity. Homeschool students are still like a very small percentage of the overall population. But I mean, as this population continues to grow, do you think there could be any push for federal oversight, since state level oversight is so scant?
I highly doubt it. There's very few federal rules governing education, like, period, on anything. And the idea that it would happen on homeschooling, I think, is even less likely than that it would happen on anything else. So, the most I could ever see would be maybe some data collection or something like that. But even that, doesn't really exist. So, I would be highly, especially the atmosphere that we're in now. We're much more likely to see dismantling than we are to see growing regulation. So I don't know. Maybe Peter has a different take, but I don't see federal regulation.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think regulation, I think, would be. I won't hold my breath for that. I do think it'll be interesting to see if we have any enunciation at the federal level, whether that's from a future Secretary of Education or even a future, United States president, of anything about homeschooling, of homeschooling policy. I mean, as you point out, it's still, and this is something we try never to lose sight of in our reporting, and I don't think anyone should lose sight of reporting on homeschooling, is it's still, a small proportion of kids. But it's not as small as it once was. Our estimates are that there could now be up to, I think, what we have, up to 2.7 million, Laura,
That's
potentially
right.
homeschooled in the United States. So, it's a number that is, at this point, far surpassed the number of children, for instance, enrolled in parochial schools in the country, even if it doesn't yet, even if it's not on par yet with the number of kids enrolled in public charter schools, let alone in public schools. But for comparison's sake, there are about 3.5 million kids enrolled in public charter schools. Charter schools are something you hear a lot about from the federal policy level. If there are 2.7 million homeschooled children, will we start hearing something about them? I mean, it's proportionally not a ton, but it's still a lot of kids, especially to exist in, what in many places is a really completely unregulated environment. So, I think that's an excellent question. And I would just be curious, not so much for what regulation might look like, but for what any nods from the federal level toward what homeschooling policy should be might look like, or any whether that's in a speech or an appearance by a federal official at a homeschooling conference or anything like that, because none of that's really happened before, because homeschooling was too small.
We so often hear.
Yeah. I'm sorry, keep in mind charter schools, of course, is public money, and that's why things are getting more complicated as public money is now going to homeschoolers in some states. So that's what's driving this potential increase of regulation on the state level. So
we so often hear that the most popular sessions during our trainings are those led by journalists because you help us think in the ways that we need to think, and you have insights that you have shared from your own reporting that will help the journalists. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank Laura Meckler and Peter Jameson for joining us for today's session. So thank you so much.